Hi everyone, welcome to your first story time. I'm super excited to read to you the Anthony Horowitz book called Stormbreaker. I love this story because as it warms up and you get into it, there are the most exciting plot turns and twists. So if you stick with us throughout these chapters, I guarantee at some point you will say, this is one of your favourite books. It is amazing. It also links really well to our topic of identity because the main character in this is finding out more about himself, his own identity, and the identity of his family members, which he didn't know initially. So it really links quite well, and as we go through our topic days, we will use extracts from this to create some really exciting pieces of work, okay? So let's get started then. So the first chapter is called Funeral Voices. I mean, it already sounds interesting, doesn't it? When the doorbell rings at 3 in the morning, it's never good news. Alex Ryder was awoken by the first chime. Ding dong. His eyes flickered open, but for a moment he stayed completely still in his bed, lying on his back with his head resting on the pillow. He heard a bedroom door open and a creak of wood as somebody went downstairs. The doorbell rang a second time. Bing bong. And he looked at the alarm clock glowing beside him. 3:02 a.m. There was a rattle as someone slid the chain off the front door. He rolled out of bed and walked over to the open window, his bare feet pressing down on the carpet pile. The moonlight spilled onto his chest and shoulders. Alex was 14, already well built, the body of an athlete. His hair cut short, apart from two thick strands hanging over his forehead, and it was fair. His eyes were brown and serious. For a moment he stood silently, half hidden in the shadow, looking out. There was a police car outside. From his second floor window, Alex could see the black ID number on the roof of the caps of two men who were standing in the front door. The porch light went on, and at the same time the door opened. Mrs. Ryder? No, I'm the housekeeper. What is it? What's happened? Is this the home of Mr. Ian Ryder? Yes. I wonder if we can come in. And Alex already knew. He knew from the way the police stood there, awkward and unhappy. But he also knew from the tone of their voices, funeral voices. That's how he would later describe them, the sorts of voices people use when they come to tell you that someone close to you has died. He went to the door and opened it. He could hear the two policemen talking down the hall, but only some of the words reached him. A car accident. We called the ambulance. Intensive care. There was nothing anyone could do. So sorry. It was only hours later, sitting in the kitchen, watching as the grey light of morning bled slowly through the London streets, that Alex could try to make sense of what happened. His uncle, Ian Ryder, was dead. Driving home, his car had been hit by an old lorry at Old Street roundabout, and he had been killed instantly. He hadn't been wearing a seatbelt, the police said. Otherwise, he might have had a chance. Alex thought of the man who had been his only relation for as long as he could remember. He had never known his own parents. They had died in an accident that won a plane crash a few weeks after he had been born. He had been brought up by his father's brother, never uncle, Ian Ryder. He hated that word. So that means he never called him uncle, he always called him Ian Ryder because he hated the word uncle. I wonder why. And he spent most of his 14 years in the same terrace house in Chelsea, London, between the King's Road and the river. But it was now only Alex, and he only just realised how little he knew about Ian Ryder. A banker, people said. Alex looked quite like him. Ian Ryder was travelling, always. A quiet private man who liked good wine, classical music and books. He didn't seem to have any girlfriends. In fact, he didn't have any friends at all. He had kept himself fit, never smoked, and had dressed expensively. But that wasn't enough. That wasn't a picture of a whole life. It was only a tiny thumbnail sketch. "Are you all right, Alex?" A young woman had come into the room. She was in her late 20s with a sprawl of red hair around her boyish face. Jack Starbright was American. She had come to London as a student 7 years ago, rented a room in the house in return for light work, babysitting duties, and a place to stay, and had stayed on to become housekeeper of one of Alex's closest friends. Sometimes he wondered what the Jack was short for. Was it Jackie or Jacqueline? Neither of them seemed to suit her, and although he had asked her once, she never even said. Alex nodded. What do you think will happen?" he asked. "What do you mean?" "To the house? To me? To you?" I don't know," she shrugged. "I guess Ian would have made a will. He'd have left some instructions." "Maybe we should look in his office." "Yes, but not today, Alex. Let's take it one step at a time." Ian's office was a room running the full length of the house, high at the top. It was the only room that had always been locked. Alex had only been in there 3 or 4 times, and never on his own. When he was younger, he had fantasized that there might be something strange up there, a time machine, a UFO, but it was only an office with a desk, a couple of filing cabinets, shelves full of papers and books. Bank stuff, that's what Ian said. Even so, Alex wanted to go up there now, because he had never been allowed. The police said that he wasn't wearing his seatbelt. Alex turned to look at Jack. She nodded. "Yes, that's what they said." "Doesn't that seem strange to you? You know how careful he was. He always wore his seatbelt. He wouldn't even drive me round the corner without making me put mine on." Jack thought for a moment, then shrugged. "Yeah, it is strange," she said, "but that must have been the way it was. Why would the police have lied?" The day dragged on. Alex hadn't gone to school, even though secretly he had wanted to. He would have preferred to escape back to the normal life, the clang of the bell, the crowds of familiar faces, instead of sitting there, trapped inside the house. I think we all know how that feels. #lockdown. But he had to be there for the visitors who came throughout the morning and the rest of the afternoon. There were 5 of them, a solicitor who knew nothing about a will, but seemed to have been in charge with organising the funeral, a funeral director who had been recommended by the solicitor, a vicar, a tall elderly who seemed disappointed that Alex didn't look more upset, a neighbour from across the road, how did she even know anyone had died, and finally, a man from the bank. "All of us at Royal and General are deeply shocked," he said. He was in his 30s, wearing a polyester suit with a Marks and Spencer's tie. He had the sort of face you forgot even when you were looking at it, and he introduced himself as Crawley, from personal. "But if there's anything we can do—" "What will happen?" Alex asked for the second time that day. "You do not have to worry," Crawley said. "The bank will take care of everything. That's my job. You leave it to me." The day passed. Alex killed a couple of hours in the evening playing his PlayStation, and then felt vaguely guilty when Jack caught him doing it. But what else was he to do? Later on, she took him to Burger King. He was glad to get out of the house, but the two of them barely spoke. Alex assumed Jack would have gone back to America because that's where she was from. She certainly couldn't stay in London forever. So who would look after him? His parents had passed away before he was born, and his only relative, Ian Ryder, was no longer alive. By law, he was still too young to look after himself. His whole future looked so uncertain that he preferred not to talk about it. He preferred not to talk at all. Then the day of the funeral arrived, and Alex found himself dressed in a dark jacket, preparing to leave in a black car that had come from nowhere, surrounded by people he had never met. Ian Ryder was buried in Brompton Cemetery on Fulham Road, just in the shadow of Chelsea football ground, and Alex knew where he would have preferred to be on that Wednesday afternoon. About 30 people had turned up to the funeral, but he hardly recognised any of them. A grave had been dug close to the lane that ran the length of the cemetery, and as the service began, a black Rolls-Royce, a very expensive car, drew up, and the back door opened and a man got out. Alex watched him as he walked forward and stopped. Overhead, a plane coming in to land at Heathrow momentarily blotted out the sun. Alex shivered. There was something about this new arrival, this man, that made his skin crawl. And yet the man was ordinary to look at. Grey suit, grey hair, grey lips and grey eyes. His face was expressionless. The eyes behind the square gunmetal spectacles were completely empty. Perhaps that was what disturbed Alex. Whoever this man was, he seemed to have less life than anyone in the cemetery, above or below the ground. Someone tapped Alex on the shoulder, and he turned round to see Mr. Crawley leaning over him. "That's Mr. Blunt." The personal manager whispered, "He's the chairman of the blank." Alex's eyes travelled past Blunt and over to the Rolls-Royce. 2 more men had come with him. One of them, the driver. They were wearing identical suits, and although it wasn't particularly a bright day, both were wearing sunglasses. Both of them were watching the funeral with some grim faces. Alex looked from them to Blunt and then to the other. People who had come to the cemetery. Had they really known Ian Ryder? Why had he never met any of them before? And why did he find it so difficult to believe that any of them really worked for a bank? "A good patriotic man. He will be missed," completed the vicar as he finished his graveside address. His choice of words struck Alex as odd. Patriotic? That meant he loved his country, but as far as Alex knew, Ian Ryder had barely spent any time in it. Certainly, he had never been one for waving the Union Jack. He looked around, hoping to find Jack, but instead saw that Blunt was making his way towards him, stepping carefully around the grave. "You must be Alex." The chairman was only a little taller than him. Close to, his skin was strangely unreal. It could have been made of plastic. "My name is Alan Blunt," he said. "Your uncle often spoke about you." "That's funny," Alex said. "Never mentioned you." The grey lips twitched briefly. "We'll miss him. He was a good man." "What was he good at?" Alex said. "He never talked about his work." Suddenly, Crawley was there. "Your uncle was overseas finance manager, Alex," he said. "He was responsible for the foreign branches. You must have known that. That's why he always travelled." "I know he travelled a lot," Alex said. "And I know he was very careful about things like seat belts." "Well, sadly he wasn't careful enough." Blunt's eyes, magnified by the thick lenses of his spectacles, lasered into his own, and for a moment Alex felt himself pinned down like an insect under a microscope. "I hope we'll meet again." Blunt went on. He tapped the side of his face with a single grey finger. "Yes." Then he turned and went back to his car. It was as he was getting into the Rolls-Royce that it happened. The driver leaned across to open the back door, and his jacket fell open, revealing the shirt underneath. And not just the shirt. The man was wearing a leather holster with an automatic pistol strapped inside. Alex saw it even as the man, realising what had happened, quickly straightened up and put his jacket across his chest. Blunt had seen it too. He turned back and looked again at Alex. Something very close to an emotion slivered across his face. Then he got into the car and closed the door and he was gone. A gun? At a funeral? Why? Why would a bank manager carry a gun? Let's get out of here. Suddenly Jack was at his side. Cemeteries give me the creeps. Yes, quite a few creeps have turned up, Alex muttered. They slipped away quietly and went home. The car that had taken them to the funeral was still waiting, but they preferred the open air. The walk took them 15 minutes. As they turned the corner into their street, Alex noticed a removal van parked in front of the house, the words Striker and Son painted on the side. What's doing that? He began. At the same moment, the van shot off, its wheels skidding over the surface of the road. Alex said nothing. Jack unlocked the door and let them in. But while she went into the kitchen to make some tea, he looked quickly around the house. A letter that had been on the table now lay on the carpet. A door that had been half open was now closed. Tiny details, but Alex's eyes missed nothing. Somebody had been in the house. He was almost sure of it. But he wasn't certain until he got to the top floor. The door to the office, which had always been locked, was now unlocked. Alex opened it and went in. The room was empty. Ian Ryder had gone, and so had everything else. The desk drawers, the cupboards, the shelves, anything that might have told him about the dead man's work had been taken. Alex! Jack calling him from downstairs. Alex took one last look around the forbidden room, wondering again about the man who had worked there. He closed the door and went back down. I think already we're starting to spot a few clues, but you'll have to tune in tomorrow for the next chapter, Heaven for Cars. Promise you, this book gets really good. See you tomorrow.